My phone rang at 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after I'd cleaned out my desk at Sovereign Capital. It was Chloe, from what used to be my team, and her voice was shaking. The revenue portals are down, all of them. The board is walking into the main conference room right now, and nobody can pull up a single account, Chloe said rapidly, panic rising in her throat. I took a sip of my coffee. It was still warm. Okay, I said calmly. I didn't ask follow-up questions because I already knew the answer to every one of them. I'd known for 3 weeks. I just hadn't known it would happen on a Tuesday during a board meeting 13 minutes before the managing partner needed to present quarterly numbers. Welcome to Payback Office, the channel where the people who get quietly pushed aside finally get to tell their side of the story. I'm glad you're here. My name is Eden Carlisle, and for 10 years I was the person at Sovereign Capital who made sure things worked. Not the person whose name was on the org chart in a box near the top. The person underneath all those boxes, holding the structure together so nobody above ever had to think about how heavy it actually was. I never minded that arrangement. I liked the work. I liked knowing that when a client's quarterly statement generated at 4 a.m. without a single error, it was because I'd spent a Sunday afternoon rebuilding the reconciliation process from the ground up. Nobody ever saw that Sunday. They just saw a statement that looked correct, which to most people looks like nothing at all. I wasn't the kind of person who needed credit for that. I'd watched plenty of people chase credit over the years, and it always seemed exhausting. Always performing, always positioning, always making sure the right person saw you do the thing. I didn't have the appetite for it. I had the appetite for the work itself, for the quiet satisfaction of a system that didn't break. That's not martyrdom. I was genuinely, fully absorbed in work I found satisfying, so absorbed that I stopped paying attention to the only part of the job that ever actually mattered to the people above me, which was who got to stand next to the numbers when they looked good. I joined Sovereign Capital 10 years ago as an operations associate, back when the firm managed about $400 million in client assets across maybe 60 households. By the time I left, that number was closer to $2.5 billion, and almost every system that made that growth survivable had my fingerprints somewhere underneath it. I built the reconciliation system that matched client statements against custodian records every night. I rebuilt the revenue portal, the dashboard every advisor and director used every morning, twice, once when the firm switched custodians, and once when the old system couldn't handle the volume anymore. Neither of those rebuilds had a launch party. One Monday morning, the portal just worked better than it had on Friday, and everyone went about their day assuming it had always been that way. For the first 3 years, my job didn't have a name that made sense to anyone outside the firm. My title said Operations Associate, but what I actually did was notice things before they became problems. I built systems that worked invisibly, the kind that only became visible when they stopped happening. Jensen Lockhart joined Sovereign about 4 years into my time there as a senior relationship director. He came from a bigger firm downtown with a resume that listed assets under management in the billions and client relationships going back 15 years. What the resume didn't say was that, at his old firm, an entire operations team had been quietly cleaning up after him the whole time. My first real interaction with him happened about 6 weeks after he started. The custodian had changed a data format overnight without telling anyone. I caught it at 6 a.m. and had the reconciliation script patched and rerun by 8. Jensen came by my desk around 9, holding a printed statement. "These numbers look different from yesterday. Is something wrong with the system?" Jensen asked dismissively, holding the paper out like he wanted someone to take it from him. There was a formatting issue from the custodian overnight. I caught it and corrected it before the batch went out. "Those numbers are the right ones now," I said without looking up from my screen. "Oh, good," Jensen said flatly, already turning to walk away. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it was the first small data point in what would become a very consistent pattern. Jensen Lockhart experienced the firm's infrastructure the way most people experience electricity. It was simply there until it wasn't. A few months later, I'd flagged an error in one of his clients' fee calculations. A discrepancy that would have meant his client was overcharged by about $4,000 over the course of a year. I sent him a brief email explaining the issue and the fix. His reply came back within minutes. "Thanks, you're a lifesaver. Don't know what we'd do without you." Jensen typed quickly, the exclamation point doing the work that actual attention might have done instead. It was a nice thing to say, but some small, honest part of me noticed that he meant it as a joke. "Don't know what we'd do without you" was, to Jensen, a figure of speech, not a sentence with an actual answer underneath it. I would spend the next several years finding out exactly what they'd do without me. The years move the way years do when you're good at your job and nobody's watching the clock for you. Jensen's years moved differently. His moved upward. By his third year at Sovereign, he'd been promoted to Director of Client Relations. The managing partner, a man named Holloway, had taken a liking to him. Jensen, with his easy charm and his talent for making every client feel important, looked exactly like a next chapter to someone who'd stopped paying close attention. I'd been promoted, too, to Senior Operations Manager, which came with a small raise and a slightly larger workload, and absolutely no change in how visible any of it was. I managed a team of 3 by that point. We ran the reconciliation systems, the revenue portal, the client reporting pipeline, the compliance documentation that kept the firm's regulatory filings clean. Jensen, during one March, stopped by my office to ask if I'd seen the draft of his presentation for the audit kickoff meeting. "These look great. I think you might want to double-check the AUM figure on slide 4, though it's using last quarter's number instead of the current one," I said while still typing. "Oh yeah, I'll have someone fix that," Jensen said casually, already walking toward the door. That was the year I started noticing a particular phrase Jensen used whenever something at the firm worked well. He'd say, "We built that," in client meetings, in firm-wide emails, in casual hallway conversations that somehow always seemed to happen near Holloway's office door. "We built that reporting system. We streamlined that process. We've really tightened up our operations." I don't think he was lying, exactly. Jensen genuinely believed it. He had never once had to ask himself how any of it worked. The portal loaded every morning. The statements were accurate. The audits went smoothly. From where Jensen stood, those things were simply properties of Sovereign Capital. Ambient, permanent, not the result of anyone's effort, least of all his. The thing about people like that is they're not unkind. Jensen was perfectly pleasant to work with. He remembered my name. He asked about my weekend. Once, when I mentioned taking some online courses toward a certification, he told me that was a great idea and that he'd love to hear how it goes. He probably did mean it. That was almost the worst part. There was no malice anywhere in Jensen Lockhart, which meant there was nothing to push back against. Just a man slowly, cheerfully convinced that the floor he was standing on was something he had built with his own hands, and a woman a few offices down who had poured the concrete for it, one quiet weekend at a time. By the time Jensen made senior director, I had stopped expecting recognition. Holloway announced his retirement on a Friday afternoon. He'd be staying on as chairman, mostly ceremonial. The day-to-day leadership of the firm would transition to a newly created role, managing director of client services, which would oversee all advisor teams, client relationships, and operations. Jensen got the role. Nobody was surprised. For the first few months, almost nothing changed for me directly. I still reported to the same operations VP I'd always reported to, a woman named Odalys who understood exactly what my team did and why it mattered. She'd been quietly fighting for years to get my role reclassified, to get me a title that matched what I actually did. 6 months into Jensen's new role, Odalys took a position at another firm. Her position wasn't filled. Instead, operations was folded directly under Jensen's new role, for efficiency. My team now reported to him. The first sign of what that would actually mean came about 2 months later. The firm was discussing budget for the coming year, and someone had raised the question of headcount in operations. According to Chloe, Jensen had said, "Operations runs pretty smoothly at this point. I think we're probably overstaffed there. Honestly." Jensen stated confidently, looking at a slide showing the department's near-perfect audit record. Nobody in the room connected the smoothness to the staffing. Jensen looked at 4 years of nothing going wrong and concluded that nothing needed to be done. A few weeks after that, he called me into his office. "I wanted to talk to you about some restructuring we're thinking about for next year," Jensen said from behind his desk, scrolling through something on his laptop while he spoke. "Okay," I said evenly, sitting down. "Your team's been doing great work. Really, the operations stuff runs like clockwork these days. I think that actually creates an opportunity for us to think about things differently going forward," Jensen said, smiling like he was delivering good news. "What kind of opportunity?" I asked calmly. "Nothing set in stone yet, just keep doing what you're doing. You're the best at it," Jensen said warmly, already turning back to his laptop. I left his office and went back to my desk. I kept doing what I was doing because that's what I always did, and because I genuinely didn't yet understand that keep doing what you're doing and we're thinking about things differently were not actually in conflict with each other in Jensen Lockhart's mind. 3 months is not a long time, but it was long enough. The restructuring Jensen had mentioned involved a few different pieces: a new applicant tracking system, a consultant brought in to map our operational workflows, a hiring freeze that somehow didn't apply to one specific posting, operations coordinator, entry-level recent graduates encouraged to apply. I saw the job posting before anyone told me about it. The responsibilities listed were almost word for word the responsibilities from my own job description 10 years earlier. It took shape 4 weeks later, on a Wednesday, when Jensen asked me to come by his office at the end of the day. He had the door half closed when I arrived. "So, I wanted to talk through some of the changes coming with the new operational structure," Jensen said, while squaring papers on his desk that didn't need squaring. "Sure," I said, waiting. "We've brought on someone, she just finished her degree, really sharp, very eager. And honestly, with the new workflow software the consultant set up, a lot of the day-to-day stuff is going to be a lot more streamlined going forward. Templated basically," Jensen said, as if it was a compliment. "What does that mean for my role?" I asked flatly. "We found someone who can manage the day-to-day for a fraction of the cost, honestly. And look, 10 years is incredible. But a lot of what you've been doing, she'll be able to pick up pretty quickly with the new system. I think she's going to be great," Jensen said with a smile. "So you're letting me go," I said without a question mark. It's a restructuring. It's not about you specifically. We just think this is the direction that makes sense for the team going forward," Jensen said uncomfortably, using words he'd practiced saying. "Okay," I said calmly. That was it. That was the whole conversation. 10 years, and the word that ended it was okay, not because I had nothing else to say, but because I understood that anything else I said in that room would be wasted on him. He wasn't going to understand what he'd just done. Understanding wasn't available to Jensen in that moment. I stood up, thanked him for letting me know, and walked back to my desk. And somewhere on that walk, I made a decision so small it barely felt like one at all. I decided I was done holding it up. If you've been with us this far, you already know how this ends, but stick around to see exactly how it happens. We're closing in on 7,000 subscribers here at Payback Office, and every one of you watching quietly means more than you'd think. I worked my final 2 weeks the way I'd worked every week before them. Jensen had asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I'd be willing to help onboard my replacement. Her name was Tally, and she was sharp, eager, fresh out of a finance program. I liked her immediately, in the careful way you like someone you know is about to be handed a job nobody properly explained to them. For 2 weeks, I showed her the parts of the job that had names: how to pull the morning reconciliation report, how to navigate the revenue portal's dashboard view, where the client statement templates lived. These were the parts of the job that existed in writing, the parts a consultant could map onto a flowchart. What I didn't show her were the other things. The early morning checks I ran before the custodian's data format could quietly shift overnight. The manual flag I'd built into the reconciliation script that caught a specific kind of rounding error the system itself couldn't see. The relationships I'd built with two people at the custodian's support desk, who'd take my calls directly and fix things in an afternoon. I thought about whether to tell her the rest, the parts that weren't written anywhere, the parts that lived only in 10 years of paying attention. And I decided not to, not out of spite. Out of something quieter than that. The simple recognition that those things had never been mine to give away for free, and nobody had ever once asked for them, because nobody at Sovereign Capital had ever known they existed in the first place. Jensen had described my job to Tally as something a new system and 2 weeks of training could replace. So I taught her the job Jensen had described. I just didn't teach her the job I'd actually done. My last day was a Friday, and it was almost aggressively unremarkable. I packed up 10 years into 4 boxes. Chloe took me to lunch. A few people signed a card. Jensen stopped by my desk around 4, shook my hand, and told me it had been a pleasure. "We'll definitely stay in touch," Jensen said insincerely, his hand already on the door. "Take care, Jensen," I said pleasantly. I drove home that evening with the 4 boxes in my back seat, and somewhere around the 3rd stoplight from the office, I felt something settle in my chest. It wasn't relief exactly, and it wasn't grief either. It was closer to the feeling of setting down a bag you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten your shoulder, was supposed to feel different without it. The portals would still run that night, and the next morning, and probably for a while after that, momentum is a real thing. But momentum is not the same thing as maintenance. And nobody at Sovereign Capital, starting that Friday evening, was doing either one for the things I used to quietly hold together. I slept in. I took long walks. I updated my resume for the first time since I'd been hired, and was startled by how much of it there was, and how little of it anyone at Sovereign would have recognized as mine. I heard from Chloe about 3 weeks in. "Portal's been glitchy all week. It says they're looking into it. Miss you lol," Chloe texted casually. I smiled at that a little. I knew exactly what glitchy meant, and I knew exactly what it would find when they looked into it, which was nothing. Because the thing that had been quietly correcting itself every morning for years wasn't a setting anyone could find. It was a person, and that person had stopped showing up at 6. A week after that, Chloe texted again. "Hey random Q, did you used to manually check something with the custodian feed every morning? Tally mentioned the numbers looked weird on a few accounts, and nobody can figure out where the discrepancy is coming from," Chloe asked uncertainly. I read that message twice. There it was, the first thread, pulled just slightly loose. A few accounts. A few $100 here, a rounding error there, nothing that would set off alarms. "I'm sure it will figure it out. Hope it's nothing," I replied encouragingly. I meant the second part more than the first. Because I knew, with the specific certainty of someone who'd built the thing they were now trying to diagnose, that there was nothing in any manual that pointed back to a 6 a.m. habit that no longer existed. Chloe didn't push. Why would she? It was a few accounts. It was Tally's first month. New hires made mistakes, systems had hiccups, and at a firm the size of Sovereign, a handful of small discrepancies were the kind of thing that got logged, shrugged at, and quietly absorbed into next quarter's pile. I started a new role during that stretch, at a smaller firm across town, doing work that was almost entirely visible. A place that had never had the luxury of taking its operations for granted. It felt like starting over with people who already knew what they didn't know. I thought about Sovereign occasionally, the way you think about a house you used to live in, not with longing, just a kind of background awareness that it was still standing somewhere. What I didn't know yet was that the rounding error Tally had noticed wasn't an isolated thing. It was one thread of dozens, all of them connected to the same invisible structure. And somewhere in Jensen Lockhart's calendar, already scheduled, was a board meeting. The kind where the managing partners from the firm's largest institutional client would log into the revenue portal themselves to review the numbers personally before signing off on a renewed contract. Nobody at Sovereign was thinking about that meeting yet. It was just a date on a calendar. The weeks between Chloe's text and the morning everything fell apart weren't dramatic. I had a new job, a new desk, Knew people who said good morning to me and meant it. Sovereign existed mostly in the past tense for me by then. But I've pieced together what happened, mostly from Chloe, and once you line it all up, it reads less like a series of separate problems and more like a single structure settling after the foundation underneath. It quietly stops being maintained. The custodian changed their data format again, the same kind of overnight shift I used to catch at 6 in the morning. Except this time, nobody caught it at 6. Nobody caught it at all, until the Thursday batch of client statements went out with cost basis figures that were, across roughly 40 accounts, quietly and consistently wrong. It took 5 days for a client to notice. A retired orthodontist in Scottsdale who developed the habit of checking his own portfolio against his statements line by line. He called his advisor, mildly annoyed, asking why his cost basis on a municipal bond fund had jumped by $11,000 overnight. The advisor escalated it to Tally, who ran the reconciliation report the way I'd shown her. The report came back clean. Of course it did. The error wasn't in how the numbers were being checked. It was in the layer beneath that. The layer where I used to sit at 6 in the morning comparing the raw custodian feed against what the portal expected to receive. A comparison that existed nowhere in any documentation. Tally spent 2 days on it before escalating to IT, who spent another 4 days before someone finally thought to call the custodian directly, who confirmed that yes, they'd updated their file format the previous week. By the time that was fixed, about 10 days later, the 40 affected accounts had to be individually corrected, restated, and in 6 cases, reissued with formal correction letters, the kind that have to go out on letterhead, get reviewed by compliance, and get logged in a file that auditors look at very closely. Jensen, according to Chloe, was annoyed about it, annoyed in the specific way of someone who experiences a problem as an interruption rather than as information. He asked it to make sure this doesn't happen again, which it did by adding an alert, a solution that addressed maybe a third of what the 6 a.m. check used to catch. The second thing happened about 3 weeks later. One of the support contacts I'd cultivated at the custodian over the years left the company. Nobody at Sovereign knew it mattered, because nobody had ever known those relationships existed. The next time something needed fixing quickly, Tally called the custodian's general support line. The ticket sat for 9 days. By the time it was resolved, the fee discrepancy had compounded across 2 billing cycles, on accounts that included 3 of the firm's largest institutional relationships. None of this was anyone's fault, exactly. Tally was doing the job she'd been trained for, competently. It was responding to the problems they could see. Jensen was running the firm the way he'd always run it, confidently, in the rooms where confidence was what got noticed. Every individual decision, in isolation, was reasonable. But reasonable decisions, made by people who don't know what they don't know, accumulate. A single missing person doesn't create a single missing function. They create dozens of small, scattered absences, and each absence is, on its own, survivable. It's only when you stack them over a few months that you get something that looks like a structure with its load-bearing wall slowly, invisibly, removed. And all of it was converging on a single date. The quarterly review with Sovereign's largest institutional client. The morning it happened, I was sitting at my new desk with a cup of coffee, reviewing onboarding documents for a client documents that were both accurate and up to date, because somebody there had actually written down how things worked. What I didn't know was that 3 things had converged on Sovereign Capital that morning, none of them dramatic on their own, all of them quietly waiting for each other. The first was the security certificate on the revenue portal. A credential that authenticated the portal's connection to the custodian servers, set to expire annually, renewable with about 15 minutes of work by whoever happened to remember it was coming due. I'd renewed it myself every year for 9 years, usually a week or 2 early, usually without telling anyone. Nobody had renewed it this year. There was no calendar reminder because the reminder had lived in my head. At 12 minutes past midnight, the certificate quietly expired, and at 6 the next morning, the portal stopped authenticating. Every advisor, every director, including Jensen, logging in that morning found a blank dashboard and an error message. The second thing was the board meeting. The firm's largest institutional relationship, a regional pension consortium worth almost $400 million in assets, had scheduled its quarterly investment committee review for that morning. And for the first time in years, two of their analysts had asked to log into the portal directly to review performance and fee data ahead of a contract renewal vote. The third thing was everything underneath those two, the 40 restated accounts, the compounding fee discrepancies on 3 institutional relationships, the rounding errors that had been quietly accumulating for months in a corner nobody monitored anymore. Jensen walked into the building that morning already running 15 minutes behind, expecting to pull up the portal in the conference room and walk the consortium's analysts through their numbers the way he'd done a dozen times before. Instead, he got a blank screen, a room full of people waiting, and, within about 20 minutes, a phone call from the consortium's lead analyst asking whether there was an issue accessing the portal. Must be a glitch, IT's looking into it. Jensen laughed nervously, trying to cover. It could not fix it quickly, because fixing it meant identifying that a certificate had expired, which meant knowing the certificate existed, which meant knowing where it lived in the system's configuration, a piece of information that existed in exactly 0 documents. While it scrambled, the consortium's analysts began asking other questions. One of them noticed a fee figure on a printed summary that didn't match a figure from the previous quarter's report by an amount that was small individually, but consistent across several accounts in a way that looked less like a rounding quirk and more like a billing error that had been quietly compounding. By the time the portal came back online, almost 90 minutes later, the consortium's analysts had already shifted from reviewing performance numbers to asking, politely but pointedly, for a full audit of the fee calculations on their accounts going back 2 years. Jensen spent the rest of that day in his office with the door closed, on the phone, first with the consortium's relationship lead, trying to reassure her that this was an isolated technical issue, and then with Holloway, whose voice was loud enough that people 2 offices down could hear the tone of it. It was sometime during that second call that Jensen, apparently scrolling back through old emails looking for documentation, found a thread from 9 years earlier. A short email with a subject line that just said, "Cert renewal done. Sent by me." Chloe said that was the first time, in the 6 months since I'd left, that she'd heard Jensen say my name out loud. My phone rang about 20 minutes after that. The revenue portals are down, all of them. The board is walking into the main conference room right now, and nobody can pull up a single account, Chloe said frantically, breathless and panicked. I took a sip of my coffee. It was still warm. Okay, I said calmly. I'm trying to run the mid-month revenue report for the managing partner, and the system keeps timing out. I saw you used to send these. Is there a trick to getting it to process? Chloe asked desperately. I don't work there anymore, Chloe, I said gently. I know, but nobody can access anything. Tally can't figure out how to refresh the client portals and clients are furious. Can you just point me in the right direction? Chloe pleaded urgently. I'm sure they'll figure it out, I said kindly but firmly. Please, Eden, can you just tell me which system to log into? The managing partner is losing his mind. The board members are already in the conference room, Chloe begged, speaking faster than she was breathing. I hope you all figure it out, I said calmly and ended the call. 3 minutes later, my phone rang again. Different number. I let it go to voicemail. When I played it back an hour later, it was Holloway. Eden, it's Chairman Holloway. I'm told you're no longer with the company, which is news to me, and I'm currently in a board meeting where I cannot access any of the quarterly financial data. I need you to call me back immediately. This is extremely urgent, Holloway said tightly, controlled fury barely masked because he was in front of important people. I deleted the voicemail and made myself lunch. The full story came to me in pieces over the next 72 hours from people who'd worked with me and were watching the disaster unfold from the inside. The quarterly board meeting was a catastrophe. Holloway had to present revenue projections without any of the actual revenue data. The dashboards I'd maintained were completely inaccessible. Tally had the password to the front-end system, but didn't know that the backend databases required separate authentication that reset every 90 days. That authentication had expired 4 days earlier. Holloway improvised using summary numbers from the previous quarter, which made the board ask detailed follow-up questions he couldn't answer. The meeting ran 2 hours over schedule and ended with the board chair suggesting that Sovereign's internal controls needed serious examination. When they finally got someone from it to crack open the systems I'd maintained, they discovered that the QtWo data had never been properly reconciled. Tally had been running reports, but she'd been pulling from the preliminary data feeds, not the reconciled versions. Every number Sovereign's leadership had been citing for client performance over the past 6 weeks was wrong. Not dramatically, off by maybe 3 to 7%, but wrong enough that, when the board started comparing Jensen's verbal updates from May to the actual corrected data, the discrepancies were obvious and unexplainable. Then the client complaints started coming in. Pemberton Industrial, one of Sovereign's oldest accounts, sent a formal letter demanding to know why their quarterly statement showed portfolio activity from 2019. 2 other clients reported similar issues. Tally was trying her best, but her best didn't include knowledge of systems that predated her birth or integrations that existed nowhere, except in custom scripts I'd written and maintained. Jensen kept telling her to figure it out, which is what you say when you also don't know how something works. The consortium's audit request wasn't something that could be fixed in a day. It took almost 3 months, involved an outside accounting firm, and turned up exactly what I'd have expected. Not fraud, nothing dramatic, just months of small, compounding billing errors across several of the firm's largest accounts. The kind of thing that, individually, looked like nothing, and in aggregate, looked like a pattern of carelessness. The consortium didn't renew. Neither did 2 of the other large relationships that had been quietly affected by the same compounding errors. Not dramatically, not with angry phone calls, just the quiet attrition that happens when clients who'd never had a reason to question a firm suddenly find one. Holloway came out of retirement for about 6 months. Jensen kept his title, technically, through all of it, but most of the major client relationships had been quietly redistributed to other directors for stability, and Jensen spent most of his days now in meetings that didn't seem to go anywhere. He never, as far as I know, asked anyone what had actually gone wrong. I don't think he ever fully understood that anything had changed, only that, somehow, the floor under him had gotten a little less solid. As for me, I've been at my new firm for over a year now. It's smaller, and the work is different in a satisfying way. Here, when something I build works well, people notice. A few months ago, my manager asked me to help redesign their reconciliation process from the ground up, and this time, I wrote everything down. Every check, every relationship, every quiet 6 a.m. habit. Not because I think I'll ever leave the way I left Sovereign, but because I learned what happens to a structure when the person holding it up forgets to leave instructions. Some mornings, I still wake up around 5:30 out of old habit, and for a moment, I almost reach for my laptop before I remember there's nothing waiting for me that I haven't already accounted for. Those mornings, I make coffee instead and sit on my porch for a while before the day starts, which is as close to a happy ending as a story like this gets. Not loud, not triumphant, just quiet in a way that finally belongs to me. If this story felt familiar, if you've ever been the person holding something together that nobody else could see, we're almost at 7,000 subscribers here at Payback Office, and we'd love to have you with us for the next one. Thanks for listening.